Hi friends, my name's Chris, and this week we continue with Boethius and the Consolations of Philosophy. We'll be covering books 1, 2, and 3, and talking a bit about Lady Philosophy's diagnosis of Boethius, his condition, about the nature of happiness, and what Boethius has gotten wrong about happiness. I hope you guys enjoy the discussion. So last week, we talked a little bit about who Boethius was. He was a very educated and learned man who was born around 400 years after Christ, near the fall of the Roman Empire. He was one of the last generations that was able to kind of receive a classical Roman education. So he learned, the works of Homer, all of the famous like tragedies. He'd learned Platonic philosophy and of all of the Greek philosophers like Zeno and Parmenides and Anaxagoras and all of the pre-Socratics. Um, and so when the empire fell, or when the Western Roman Empire fell, it was taken over by the Goths, or the Ostrogoths. And the king of the Ostrogoths at the time was a man named Theodoric. And so because of his family's status, and because of, I guess, his social position, he was lucky enough to be afforded a seat alongside Theodoric in this new kingdom. He was kind of like a counselor to him, I guess, working in the Senate. And Boethius was someone who had, anything and everything you could want at the time. He had a beautiful wife, 2 beautiful kids, more money than he would need, a good social standing, a good stable job. And the reason he kind of like engaged or got into politics was not because he cared for power, not because he wanted more money. He didn't really care about all of that stuff. He grew up reading the Republic, and in Plato's Republic, the idea was that philosophers should be the kings. It's people who have cultivated these virtues and like who kind of know the difference between good and wrong that should be the ones making decisions. And he took it upon himself like a sort of duty. Nothing to do with like ego or pride, but he saw it as a duty for him to be one of the people to inform the Senate on what would be good and wrong. And it was philosophy that taught him this. And so unfortunately, because of his ties to Rome, because of simply just being raised with these Roman or Greek ideals, he was eventually accused of treason. And so Theodoric, growing very paranoid at the time because of the messiness of the Middle Ages with kingdoms collapsing every couple decades, he was very afraid. So he locked up Boethius and put him in a prison cell, and then in this prison cell is where he decides to write the Consolation of Philosophy. Boethius's whole life goal at this point was to preserve classic Stoic, Platonic, Aristotelian ideals and kind of like carry them into the Middle Ages. And he wanted to do so through translating all of these ancient Greek texts into a more accessible Latin. And so the central question that he's forced to kind of like ponder in this jail cell for this 1 year was, well, why do good things happen, or why do bad things happen to good people? It's probably, it's a question that everyone kind of has growing up. And it's interesting because like his situation is, it seems like very like synonymous or like similar to that of Socrates. Socrates was imprisoned for corruption of the youth and sentenced to death, and now all of a sudden Boethius, one of Socrates' students, one of Plato's students and Aristotle's students, now the same thing is happening to him. And so it's this idea of like fortune comes up, and that what really is in fortune's hand is quite a lot more than Boethius was kind of giving it credit. A lot of life is just kind of random chance. The reason he had a beautiful wife was because of random chance. The reason he was born into the family he was born into was just kind of like random chance, and he was attributing a lot of his happiness to these different things. And so from all of these works, he became kind of famous, obviously. People like Dante read this book. Aquinas read this book. Queen Elizabeth even read this book. And they were all heavily influenced by Boethius. But the three takeaways, I guess, from last book club was that fortune is fickle. The inner life, which I guess we'll talk about in a second, is very secure. And that philosophy can be divided into two different kind of camps for Boethius: practical and metaphysical, or let's say like theoretical. The practical side of philosophy is concerned with like Greek or Stoic philosophy. It's concerned with ethics, on how to live, on how to be happy, on morality. And then the theoretic side of philosophy, that's more like theology. That's more like metaphysics. Um, that's more like I don't know, ontology. And so in this time in the past, in like the Middle Ages, philosophy was not understood as something, predominantly metaphysical or predominantly like theological. It was something more concerned with practical, ethical, day-to-day living, how to live a good life. And so that's the approach that he takes in this book. That's why it's a consolation of philosophy and not a consolation of theology or a consolation of something else. That's how he's understanding philosophy. And so, at the very, very beginning of the book one, there's this figure that appears before him in the jail cell. This woman, this lady philosophy. And she's like the embodiment of wisdom, the embodiment of knowledge. She's like this teacher figure. And she reminds him that, well, look, it's me. You've grown up learning from me. Don't act so confused. Don't act so like surprised that I'm kind of coming down here now. Um, and what I want to do, Boethius, is diagnose you a little bit in the same way a physician would diagnose you. So show me what's happening. I'm going to try and understand why you're so distressed in this moment. If I've taught you so well, there shouldn't be a reason for you to be distressed right now, but for some reason you are, so let's take a look at this like wound. And Boethius asks her, why did you come down to this cell? And she said, well, I've always kind of been in this cell. It's not the first time I've been down in this cell. I was down in this cell when Socrates was imprisoned. I was down in this cell when Anaxagoras was banished from Athens. I was down in this cell when Zeno was being tortured. I'm very familiar with this cell. Wisdom throughout the ages has constantly been threatened by these evils. These people that have accused you of treason, I'm very familiar with these types of people. And so Boethius opens up a little bit and he starts kind of like complaining and getting mad. He's like, well, I dedicated my life to exactly your teachings. I dedicated my life to trying to do what's just, to trying to figure out how to do the most good possible by getting involved in politics. So why is all this bad stuff happening to me? It seems like all of the wicked have piled up against the virtuous, have piled up against me, and now I'm stuck here. I'm worse off than a criminal, he says. He says, at least criminals get a fair trial. At least they get to be heard in court. I'm not even given that right. And so she says, well, before I give you any serious type of remedy, before I give you any like high dose of medicine, let me start off with like some simple types of medicine, some gentler medicine. And so she says to him, essentially, and so it is not the sight of this place which gives me concern. So the fact that you're in this cell, that doesn't really worry me. The fact that you've had your family and your wealth, all of this stuff stripped from me, that doesn't really concern me very much. It's not the walls of your library with their glass and ivory decoration that I'm looking for. It's not all these riches you had, but the seat in your mind. That is the place where I once stored away, not my books, but the thing that makes them have any value, the philosophy they contain. Because Boethius, how ironic that you spent your life learning philosophy and now all of a sudden you've lost it. What happened here? And so then she goes on to say, Well, Boethius, like, listen closely. You've forgotten your true nature. And so I have found out in full the reason of your sickness. You're sick because of your nature. Your nature has changed. You've kind of forgotten what it means to be a philosopher. And it's because you are confused by the loss of memory that you wept and claimed you had been banished and robbed of all your possessions. Boethius, just a second ago you were saying you lost everything. I don't think that's entirely right. It's because you don't know the end and purpose of things that you think the wicked and the criminal have power and happiness. So he says, I think what she's kind of trying to say here to Boethius is that in Boethius's mind, the wicked, the people who accuse them of treason, they're happy now. They're in a position of power. They got to keep all of their wealth. And what Lady Philosophy is trying to remind him is that it seems like you've forgotten what it means to be powerful. It seems like you've forgotten what it means to be wealthy. Because wealth isn't something that can be taken away really easily. It's not like your family, it's not like your friends, it's not like your money. And so she's kind of like telling him, well, you've misconceived of what happiness means, of what wealth means, and so on. And then book two kind of comes around. And this is where Lady Philosophy introduces Boethius to this concept of fortune, which we kind of talked about a little bit. And that at the root of all of this suffering, or at the root of all of this loss, you seem to have kind of been victim to, or are victim to. Fortune doesn't really care about you. Fortune doesn't give or take because she feels like she owes you anything. Nothing is really yours. At least nothing you think was yours is really yours. Your wife isn't yours. Your kids aren't yours. Your house isn't yours. Your job isn't yours. Your reputation isn't yours. Your relationships, none of that stuff is yours. And for a long time, I guess, you've been misled, or for one reason or another, you thought that those things were yours. No, Boethius, you're wrong here. Attachment to this stability, to this fake stability, attachment to people you love, attachment to your family, attachment to your wealth or any type of like possession, attachment to anything that can be taken away by fortune, that is very irrational. And I think this is the really, really interesting part for me, at least. It's the irrationality that Lady Philosophy is warning him of. And now Boethius is a Christian, right? And so we just came back from reading Kierkegaard, and oftentimes Christians rely on faith for happiness or for fulfillment or for purpose. Faith, however, is not something that's very rational. You need to kind of like choose it. There's no like logical argument that can convince you to have faith. You've misconceived of faith if that's what you're thinking faith is, or if that's what you're thinking. If that's how you're thinking you arrive to faith through argument. No, it's through it's through just like willing, a complete willing. And so what Lady Philosophy is saying here is that the thing you are attaching yourself, stability, is irrational. And so she's relying in some sense on rationality as the saving grace for Boethius. For a Christian, it's not faith that's going to save you here, it's reason. And what's reason? Reason is philosophy. It's the ability to reason and deduce and that type of stuff. And so I guess at this point I was kind of asking myself, well, why would a Christian write a meditation on reason as opposed to faith in the last year of his life when he knows he's going to die? Why is he relying on philosophy instead of religion? Why is this not the consolation of theology, or the consolation of a theodicy? And I don't have a good answer. I'd love to hear input on that later, but it seems to be reason that Lady Philosophy is after and that she's praising. And then she introduces this concept of like division in happiness. So Boethius's life had been one that'd been like very, very happy, I guess. Um, and so she kind of like starts telling Boethius that all of these things you thought were required for happiness weren't real happiness. They aren't genuine happiness. Why? Because genuine happiness needs to be a unity. It needs to be something that's indivisible, something that is not a multiplicity. And so the way I'm kind of seeing it is that Boethius's life, its happiness was constitutive of multiple little like external things. Boethius was happy because he had wealth, he had family, he had friends, he had reputation. All of those things were kind of like mashing together and then creating this concoction of externals. And then that was kind of giving him happiness. And Lady Philosophy here is saying, well, no, you can, if you take one of these away, now all of a sudden you're less happy. Happiness shouldn't be this thing that you can divide. For example, like having like money, imagine $1 million would probably make you kind of happy. And now if I took half of that away, if I took away $500,000, now all of a sudden you're half as happy. That seems like a really silly like way of understanding happiness is something that can just be like taken and given away and cut up like a percentage. Um, there's no way that this is happiness. And like think back to philosophy, think back to these Greeks. Um, Remind yourself what it truly means to be happy. So the main takeaways, I guess, from book two are that these former goods, these things you thought to be good, like like relationships, like having kids, like having a career, having money, all of these things, they were very unstable and they could be taken out. The legs could be kicked from underneath, and at any moment you can lose it all to fortune. Um, and true happiness cannot be taken away by fortune. True happiness cannot be divided. And this sense of loss that you're feeling, Boethius, this loss is because you you based there was this sense of ownership that you had over these things that weren't really yours. It was very silly of you to think that you owned things um, that were just completely outside of you, that fortune owned, not you. So happiness must be independent of fortune, I think would be like the takeaway of book two. Book three. So I guess book two was kind of saying what happiness was not, or it was saying it was diagnosing him a little bit and kind of saying where he went astray. And book three, I guess it starts to get a little bit closer to like a definition of what happiness must mean. And so first it starts to do like it starts to kind of like attack happiness through negation. So it tries to see, okay, well, the things you thought were related to happiness, let's look at them and let's see why they weren't genuine happiness. And the first one that comes up is wealth. Well, wealth is not genuinely happiness. Firstly, because it's not self-sufficient. If you're on an island alone and you have a bunch of money, you're not going to be happy. It's an indirect type of happiness that it can bring. Next up is something I already kind of mentioned. It's something that's very divisible. And if happiness is divisible, then it's not very genuine. If you're less happy when you lose half of your money, then it means that your happiness could be divided, not genuine. It doesn't really remove any type of anxiety. If you're an anxious person, or if you're anxious about death, or if you're existentially anxious, just having a big bank account isn't really going to solve that issue. So no, Boethius, it definitely wasn't. Definitely wasn't wealth that's genuine. Okay, what about honor? Maybe honor. So it can be kind of bestowed onto you, and in that way, it's something that's given externally. It's a little bit unstable in that it depends on others. For you to be honored requires another person, and other people are very kind of fickle, and they can change their opinions. So that's unstable, not good enough. It doesn't meet the criteria for what genuine happiness should be. Power. Ooh, maybe if you had a lot of power, you'd be happy? Not really, because the powerful, think of King Theodoric, the Ostrogoth king, those who are in power, I think they're more afraid than they are happy. Well, what are they afraid of? They're afraid of losing that power, just like Theodoric was. He was growing paranoid. He couldn't sleep anymore. He was like sending all of his close friends to prison and to execution. All of his close like consul men or whatever they were called. He was throwing them all in prison because he was afraid of losing what he had. He was afraid of all of his enemies. He was afraid of the Vandals down south. He was afraid of the barbarians in the north. He was afraid of the Roman Empire coming back once again. Um, and he was afraid of fate. And so power looks a lot more like fear. So clearly that can't be genuine happiness. It gets striked down. And the last thing um, that Lady Philosophy looks at is pleasure. And this is pleasure not in a very like comprehensive or deep way, but just like a very physical, shallow um, type of like euphoric pleasure. He says, well, this can't really be what happiness is because oftentimes with these physical pleasures, food, sex, drugs, they're temporary. And so if they can be taken away really easily, if they're not kind of like enduring, then they must not be very genuine. They also kind of come with a regret, a sense of regretment, the regret you might feel after, I don't know, binge eating like uh, a huge McDonald's meal, or doing a bunch of drugs and then now you're on a come down or of a hangover after a party. There's regret involved, and what's more is that sometimes you end up being enslaved by these pleasures. And so all of these things, they're not very characteristic of what we were thinking happiness should be. Happiness should have this completeness, this unity, this indivisibility, and this stability. It shouldn't be dependent. And they talk this, she starts kind of talking more and more about this complete state. Um, and unfortunately, I think she gets to she's trying to persuade Boethius at this point of the book that happiness might not be something that's very worldly. All of these things that you thought were happiness, they were very worldly and dependent on like other material conditions in the world. Um, Happiness can't be that. It must be in some sense like metaphysical, maybe. You shouldn't be getting your happiness from materials, maybe from metaphysics. And I guess this is kind of like calling back a little bit to like the Platonic doctrine of ascension or of ascending. It's like reason is almost like reaching up into like to the heavens to like grasp at something, like grasp at this form of good, grasp at this form of, I don't know, happiness. Um, that you're not really gonna find. You're just gonna find like maybe like manifestations of it in the real world, but you're not gonna find the actual thing. But that's all I have essentially for books 1, 2, and 3. Sorry for no slides. But now I kind of want to hear what you guys have to say from that ramble. Or if you did the reading, that would be pretty sweet. But I guess generally kind of I want to ask you guys what you think of this idea that happiness should not be divisible. I don't see anything very counterintuitive with saying you can be more happy or less happy. There's no wrong with it being kind of like sliced up. Um, but yeah, that's all I have.